The New England colonies, if you were there. You live in a town near London in the early 1700s. Some of your neighbors are starting new lives in the American colonies. You would like to go with them, but you cannot afford the cost of the trip. There is one way you can go, though. You can sign a paper promising to work as a servant for 5 years. Then you would be free and in a new country. Would you sign the paper and go to America? Building background. England's first successful colony settlements were in Virginia. They were started mainly as business ventures. Other colonists in North America had different reasons for leaving their homes. Many, like the Pilgrims and Puritans, came to have freedom to practice their religious beliefs. Others, like the person above, simply wanted a new way of life. Pilgrims and Puritans. Religious tensions in England remained high after the Protestant Reformation. A Protestant group called the Puritans wanted to purify or reform the Anglican Church. The Puritans thought that bishops and priests had too much power over church members. Pilgrims on the move. The most extreme English Protestants wanted to separate from the Church of England. These separatists formed their own churches and cut all ties with the Church of England. In response, Anglican leaders began to punish separatists. The Pilgrims were one separatist group that left England in the early 1600s to escape persecution. The Pilgrims moved to the Netherlands in 1608. The Pilgrims were immigrants, people who had left the country of their birth to live in another country. The Pilgrims were glad to be able to practice their religion freely. They were not happy, however, that their children were learning the Dutch language and culture. The Pilgrims feared that their children would forget their English traditions. The Pilgrims decided to leave Europe altogether. They formed a joint stock company with some merchants and then received permission from England to settle in Virginia. On September 16, 1620, a ship called the Mayflower left England with more than 100 men, women, and children aboard. Not all of the colonists were Pilgrims. However, Pilgrim leaders such as William Bradford sailed with the group. The Mayflower Compact. After 2 months of rough ocean travel, the Pilgrims sighted land far north of Virginia. The Pilgrims knew that they would thus be outside the authority of Virginia's colonial government when they landed. This charter would not apply, so they decided to establish their own basic laws and social rules to govern the colony they would found. On November 21, 1620, 41 of the male passengers on the ship signed the Mayflower Compact, a legal document in which they agreed to have their laws to protect the general good. The compact represents one of the first attempts at self-government in the English colonies. In late 1620, Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock in present-day Massachusetts. The colonists struggled through the winter to build the Plymouth settlement. Nearly half died during this winter from sickness and the freezing weather. Pilgrims and Native Americans. In March 1621, a Native American named Samoset walked boldly into the colonist settlement. He spoke in broken English. Samoset had learned some English from the crews of English fishing boats. He gave the Pilgrims useful information about the peoples and places of the area. He also introduced them to a Patuxet Indian named Squanto. Squanto had one time lived in Europe and spoke English as well. From Squanto, the Pilgrims learned to fertilize the soil with fish remains. Squanto also helped the Pilgrims establish relations with the local Wampanoag Indians. Conditions in the Plymouth colony began to improve. The Pilgrims invited Wampanoag chief Massasoit and 90 other guests to celebrate their harvest. The first became known as the First Thanksgiving. For the event, the Pilgrims killed wild turkeys. The event marked the survival of the Pilgrims in the new colony. Pilgrim community. Although the Pilgrims overcame many problems, their small settlement still struggled. Most Pilgrims became farmers, but the farmland around the settlement was poor. They had hoped to make money by trading furs and by fishing. Unfortunately, fishing and hunting conditions were not good in the area. Some colonists traded corn with American Indians for beaver furs. The Pilgrims made little money, but were able to form a strong community. The colony began to grow stronger in the mid-1620s after new settlers arrived, and, as in Jamestown, colonists began to have more rights to farm their own land. The Pilgrim settlement was different from Virginia's in that it had many families. The Pilgrims taught their children to read and offered some education to their indentured servants. Families served as centers of religious life, health care, and community well-being. All family members worked together to survive during the early years of the colony. Women generally cooked, spun, and wove wool and sewed clothing. They also made soap and butter, carried water, dried fruit, and cared for livestock. Men spent most of their time repairing tools and working in the fields. They also chopped wood and built shelters. Women in the colony. In Plymouth, women had more legal rights than they did in England. In England, women were not allowed to make contracts, to sue, or to own property. In America, Pilgrim women had the right to sign contracts and to bring some cases before local courts. Widows could also own property. From time to time, local courts recognized the ways women helped the business community. Widow Naomi Sylvester received a large share of her husband's estate. The court called her a frugal or thrifty, and laborious or hard-working woman. Puritans leave England. During the 1620s, England's economy suffered. Many people lost their jobs. English King Charles I made the situation worse by raising taxes. This unpopular act led to a political crisis. At the same time, the Church of England began to punish Puritans because they were dissenters or people who disagreed with official opinions. King Charles refused to allow Puritans to criticize church actions. Great Migration. These economic, political, and religious problems in England led to the Great Migration. Between 1629 and 1640, many thousands of English men, women, and children left England. More than 40,000 of these people moved to English colonies in New England and the Caribbean. In 1629, Charles granted a group of Puritans and merchants a charter to settle in New England. They formed the Massachusetts Bay Company. In 1630, a fleet of ships carrying Puritan colonists left England for Massachusetts to seek religious freedom. They were led by John Winthrop. The Puritans believed that they had made a covenant or promise with God to build an ideal Christian community. A new colony. The Puritans arrived in New England well prepared to start their colony. They brought large amounts of tools and livestock with them. Like the Pilgrims, the Puritans faced little resistance from local American Indians. Today, with the Plymouth colony, trade with the Plymouth colony helped them too. In addition, the region around Boston had a fairly healthful climate. Thus, few Puritans died from sickness. All of these things helped the Massachusetts Bay Colony do well. By 1691, the Massachusetts Bay Colony had expanded to include the Pilgrims' Plymouth colony.